Thank you. So I'm very pleased to be speaking in this context. I must confess that before Michael contacted me, I was not familiar with Hepworth's turning forms. And so my research really has been based on the internet and looking at pictures from Tessa Jackson's website of the restoration process and watching Nick Clear's animation many, many times. And what I'm going to be doing in this talk is just sort of riffing on that experience that I had of thinking about the sculpture from the perspective of Nick's animation and of thinking about the conservation project. So if it's okay, I'm sort of going to be doubling back to themes which arose in the earlier section. So we've been presented with at least two ways, I think, of approaching turning forms. And what I want to do in this brief talk is just rather schematically, and I must confess I'm not a specialist in Hepworth studies, with where these different avenues take us. Do they complement one another or do they pull in alternative directions? And one stance involves starting out from the materials and techniques that Hepworth embraced. This is the account that Tessa has elucidated for us with such insight. It is what we might call the under the bonnet view. And if I may have the next picture, Rowan. Thank you. We get to see turning forms emerging from a complicated, comprehensively researched restoration program. This involves taking us back to Barbara Hepworth's St. Ives studio at the end of the 40s and reconstructing the network of suppliers plus the technical industrial expertise from which she drew. It includes replicating as faithfully as possible the intricacies of a sculptor's own making practices. And Tessa's account offers us a picture then of turning forms as an emerging thing. We envisage it as an object arising from a mixture of curved steel frames, chemicals, aggregates, liquids. Next picture, please. When I look at images of turning form as it is now installed in Wakefield so elegantly, I've learned to see the sculpture as an impressive technical accomplishment. I see it as a weighty, hefty thing composed of a core plus an accretion of hardened pastes of wet substances that have been carefully cured, fissures smoothed over, of which they've been subsequently dexterously kind of smoothed over by hand. That's one way of seeing Hepworth sculpture that I've acquired from this kind of little project of researching for this talk. And then if I could have the next image, please. But then Nick offers us another rather different way of thinking about turning forms, which is equally compelling. And these are screen grabs from the digital animation. His focus immerses us in Euclidean space, where at the center of our gaze we see a geometricized revolving turning forms. To achieve this visualization, he's focused on the work's contours. Using 3D laser scans, he's measured and recorded the sculpture's elaborate lineaments as they fold in on one another in the involuted way that they do. Then through the resulting 3D mesh models, the sculpture's bending, undulating, subtly uneven planes, he's been able to reconstruct Hepworth's wish for turning forms to be displayed to viewers in perpetual motion, revolving anti-clockwise, slowly and steadily on a motorized base. This approach invites us to see the sculpture as a work that is carefully choreographed, so that from a fixed position, viewers can attend to all aspects equally. This is sculpture that's very definitely in the round. On our screens, we see it as a pair of mutually defining, gracefully spiraling shapes. Next picture, please. It's tempting to suggest that both accounts complement one another. Since it's not technically possible for turning forms to rotate physically, Nick's visualization does provide an additional level of knowledge that feels critically significant. As it turns, the proportions and shapes of this work transform significantly. At some points during a single revolution, openings appear. At other times, the shape feels contained and enclosing, All this makes the overall proportions of the sculpture difficult to commit to memory. There is no doubt that the digital visualization helps in this regard. Just as early 20th century travelers to Florence might have positioned themselves before the Piero in the Uffizi clasping an open Baedeker, is the ideal way to view Hepworth's turning forms, to stand in the Hepworth Wakefield garden armed with a tablet so as to be able to assess the restored sculpture with one eye on its mobile digital avatar, noiselessly revolving against a dark and uncluttered background on the screens in our hands. But do these very different restorations of Hepworth's intentions complete one another so harmoniously? Or are they reconstructions that don't quite add up to a satisfactory whole? My feeling is that the two depictions of turning forms that Tessa and Nick present appear to send me off in incongruous directions. And I must emphasize that I'm not interested in discrediting anything that's been said or done. I'm merely observing that each approach presents me with a different image of the sculpture, and I'm struggling to harmonize these two accounts. The conservation project encourages me to see the sculpture from the inside out, so to speak. I come to apprehend the substances from which it's built up. But for the digital animation, the sculpture's interior, its constitutive materials, become less relevant. The important details now become the volumes, the shapes, the respective angles of the relevant planar elements, as they're set in motion by a sequence of algorithmic commands. It seems as if I'm forced to choose between two registers. On the one hand, the physical conditions relating to the business of making things, and on the other, an abstract formal realm of volumes, spatial relations, rhythms, and perpetual mobility. This discrepancy is not exactly a new one. It might feel exacerbated by 3D visualization techniques, but the digital world is not its cause. Its root lies far deeper in the Western conceptual frameworks for understanding made things hylomorphically, by which I mean the idea that making involves the impositions of a form or a design on inert matter. And this way of thinking, which is so ubiquitous, is also very much in evidence in the way in which 20th century artists and their advocates often extolled the virtues of non-figurative art. Next picture, please, Rowan. Take, for instance, some of the art debates that are loosely contemporaneous with Hepworth's turning forms, and listen to some of the rhetoric that was made about non-figurative, non-expressive art during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Sometimes such work was termed concrete art. The idea that art could be concrete, even if it wasn't made of the stuff, had first surfaced in 1924 in post-revolutionary Russia, but was taken up more emphatically during the 1930s. The concrete epithet now categorically served as a figure of speech. It was a way of accentuating that the work in question was resolutely non-figurative. It was a means of stressing that its defining elements stood at the furthest possible remove from anything that might be deemed generic, symbolic, or illusionistic. And if we could have the next picture. In a little journal called Art Concret, published in Paris in 1930, there's a manifesto statement in which a group of European artists announce, "We speak of concrete and not abstract painting because nothing is more concrete, more real than a line, a color, a surface." They're stressing, in other words, the particularity and actuality of the components of their non-figurative work, the plain, unmediated facticity of the pictorial elements themselves. And if we could have the next picture. At the same time, however, exponents of concrete art didn't necessarily want their creations to be seen as equivalent in status to other physical artifacts in the world. They saw their creations as embodying objective and universal laws that were espoused by mathematicians, logicians, physicists. Often they embraced simple logical sequences to determine the work's design, so that it would be very clear that the resulting works were the exemplification of general principles. But this leads to a tension, because the concrete artwork now has to be two things at once. We find its advocates stating that the work must be composed from art's most primary elements, colors, lines, planes, circles, spheres, etc., which have no other meaning than what they are by themselves. But when we find the same people defining art, but then we find the same people talking about art, and this is a quote from Duisberg, that he sees art as the spiritual transformation of material, which implies that when you look at the resulting creations, there's an ineffable added value, something more than the merely physical and material. So, although claims made on behalf of concrete art aspire to emphasize the work's concrete actuality, they often don't successfully acknowledge the work's material presence actually. Because such emphasis is placed on the general laws the forms manifest, the work's materiality seems to dissipate in significance before our eyes. The thing itself becomes a scaffold for a general principle which is formal in nature. Material tends to be subsumed into form. Now, in 1932, Rowan, if I could have the next picture, Hepworth travels to France and paid a visit to the sculptor Hans Arp, who was a keen exponent of concrete art. And after visiting his studio in Meudon, she expressed her dismay with his evident predilection for plaster. She felt the substance lacked tactile, sculptural appeal. But then she astutely noticed that using this material maybe served him well, given his interests seemed to point so strongly towards the realm of fluid and vague morphologies. She was implying, in other words, that artists have a kind of choice. Either they make works that manifest rich materiality and tactility, or they express formal ideas. If you privilege the latter, as she believed was the case with Arp, then parsimony in the use of materials seemed essential. Now, the language of abstract art during the middle decades of the 20th century is riddled with epithets. Material and form are two such overdetermined concepts, and they often appear mutually exclusive. And it's easy for the shortfalls in the historical terminology to replicate themselves in our own discussions. We find ourselves very often, I find as an art historian, trapped in what psychotherapists call a sort of parallel process effect, in which we unconsciously reenact historical problems. Yet how do we circumnavigate this material form binary? Because we are, of course, under no obligation to perpetuate this terminology. And the question I was sort of posing for myself is, can we develop a different framework for thinking about artworks, such as turning forms, which don't rely on concepts that appear to belong to mutually exclusive realms? If I could have the next picture. It's interesting how some of these issues feel far less significant if we embrace an alternative point of view, a perspective that was developed initially in ecological psychology, but one that's been embraced more widely in many fields. And I'm thinking of James J. Gibson's theory of affordance, pioneered in the 1970s. He developed the term affordance to describe how environmental properties afford a range of potential activities or uses for specific purposes. No, sorry, I misread that. Potential activities or uses for specific species. It was a means of shifting away from thinking ontologically about what a substance is to focusing instead on how its latent propensities and abilities to fulfill distinct purposes are realized in specific contexts. And as the literary theorist Caroline Levine has noted, the term affordance also requires us to think about materials and design simultaneously. A particular material has an array of potential capacities and limitations. It has integral constraints, which condition which shapes and forms it could potentially be transformed into. But the same applies to designs, which also constrain what materials may be employed. Furthermore, Levine adds, we don't have to think of form merely as an immaterial organizing principle. We can also address it by starting out with concrete things and abstracting from the organizing patterns that its materiality manifests. So with this in mind, Rowan, let's have a look at the next picture and let's think about snowcrete. And I noticed that you can still acquire it from B&Q. And if I'd had a bit more time, I would have definitely ordered up a bag. I noticed it only gets 2.5 stars though on its user rating, which I think perhaps is testimony to the trickiness in using this substance. But it's a commercial product which, as we now know, dates back to the 1920s. It affords architects and the construction industry a vivid alternative to the generic greyness associated with concrete. Its selling point is the brightness of the stucco surfaces it can provide. It produces an uncluttered, blank surface capable of affecting clean, unequivocal edges. It can also be molded into sharp angles. In a way, it seems to me to be a product tailor-made to comply with Le Corbusier's law of rippling. If I could have the next image, Rowan. So, I mean, Hepworth exploits these properties in snowcrete. She deploys it to generate an array of resilient, bright white surfaces off which sunlight refracts to varying degrees, generating a plethora of mesmerizing shadow effects. The surfaces she realizes in snowcrete don't necessarily come across, I think, as enveloping something solid and massed. Instead, they manifest themselves to us as mobile arched screens, with some sections appearing as sheltering awnings. And the perpetual movement of the original turning forms must have reduced enormously any feeling of the sculpture's bulkiness. Even now, the passages of the work that look bulbous and physically thick don't necessarily appear heavy. I think this is because the forms seem to lend themselves so effectively to another purpose, namely shadow play. They present themselves to us as multiple curved surfaces on which gradations of refracted light tumble and bounce. If we could have the next and final picture. As the sculpture revolves, small sections of the snowcrete stucco assume an angle perpendicular to the sun and reflect back much of its full force, generating brilliant, dazzling spots. Simultaneously, other sections are cast into deep shadow, which only accentuates the effect of pristine whiteness elsewhere. I guess I could go on and develop further this account of turning forms as a shadow-making machine, but I'll wind up merely by underlying that if our initial premise is phenomenological, and we assume that materials and forms both lend themselves to or afford specific ends and effects, then we don't necessarily have to worry about material and form as concepts that are twisting apart, pulling in opposing directions. Thank you.